The war room had gone quiet, and Davin Orek was watching the walls. Not the displays, not the technicians moving between consoles with the careful urgency of people who had stopped believing their instruments. The walls. The bioluminescent organisms that lined the inner surface of the amber vault had been cycling through colors for 91 days: gold for confidence, orange for amusement, deep red for what Orek's translation files called institutional resolve. He had learned to read them the way he had once learned to read weather on planets that didn't have weather forecasts. Useful information, free of charge. Tonight they were dark. All of them, every colony of light-producing organisms across 400 meters of curved interior surface, simultaneously extinguished. The convocation's technicians had no category for it. Orek did, or rather he had a guess, and his guesses had been accurate enough over the past 3 months that he had stopped calling them guesses. The door to his cell opened without a knock. In 11,000 years of convocation governance, the Primevort Thesival had never entered a room without its approach being logged. Orek knew this from the files his government had spent 40 years compiling. Protocol, precedent, record, these were not bureaucratic preferences for the convocation. They were the architecture of authority itself. You did not move without witness. You did not speak without record. You did not visit a human prisoner in the middle of the night without guards, without announcement, without the subsonic hum that accompanied Thesival everywhere it went. The hum was absent. Orek set his left hand flat on the bench beside him, the shortened ring finger, the band facing inward as it always did. He had been waiting for this. What he said next they were not ready to hear, neither was I. 91 days earlier, the airlock had blown inward in 3 seconds. Orek had felt it before he heard it, a pressure change, subtle, the kind of thing you only notice if you've spent enough years on ships to know the difference between a mechanical failure and a deliberate breach. He was already standing when the smoke came through. Already had his hands at shoulder height before the first Sarathi warrior cleared the frame. There were 6 of them, large even by Sarathi standards. The boarding units drew from the top of the cast structure, warriors whose scale plates had been ritually scarred with 40 or 50 victories each. Their forearms carried weapons that Orek's briefing materials had described as kinetic accelerators capable of fragmenting light hull plating, which was a technical way of saying they could put a hole through him the size of his head, without the beam losing coherence on the other side. He kept his hands up and his expression neutral. The commander, he knew it was the commander because it moved to the front and the others deferred to its angle, stopped 3 meters away. Its scale plates shifted, cycling between 2 colors, the pale green of tactical assessment and something darker underneath that Orek didn't have a translation for. He filed it away. The Sarathi had 17 documented color states and he had memorized all of them, but the data was 40 years old and species changed. What he did know was that the plate lock told him something the color states didn't. When a Sarathi was uncertain, the plates along its upper thorax locked rigid, not the combat lock, which was a full-body response. This was smaller, contained. The commander's plates had locked the moment it saw him standing there with his hands up and his face calm, and they hadn't released since. Fleet Elder Davin Orek, he said, Terran Consolidated Forces. Your prisoner. The commander's head tilted, the plates stayed locked. In the convocation's 11,000 years of enforcement operations, the species it came to discipline had done one of 2 things. They fought or they collapsed. The Sarathi had extensive protocol for both. It had nothing in its training for a 73-year-old man standing in a cargo bay with recycled air that smelled like spent coolant, hands raised, waiting to be taken. They bound his wrists with energy restraints that glowed pale blue. The band on his shortened finger caught briefly on the emitter housing before the restraint settled. He rotated it inward where it wouldn't catch again and followed them through the breach. The journey to the Amber Vault took 2 days. They put him in a transit cell 6 meters square with a viewport and a bench and a nutrition dispenser that his translator assured him was calibrated for human biology. The food it produced tasted like paper that had been briefly introduced to something that had once been adjacent to protein. He ate it without complaint. He needed the strength, and he would not give them the satisfaction of refusal. The viewport showed open space. Stars he knew by military designation rather than name, because he had spent his career in sectors where names were a luxury and coordinates were not. He had learned the habit of designation early during the Karath corridor siege, when the officer beside him had asked what the bright star to the east was called and Orek had said Sector 792 Primary, and the officer had laughed, and 3 hours later the officer was dead and the star was still there and the designation was still accurate, which was more than you could say for names. He set his left hand flat on the viewport rim. The band faced inward. It always did. He had worn it that way since the siege, since the field amputation that had taken the last joint of his ring finger, performed with a combat blade and a tourniquet and 40 seconds of time he didn't have. The band was a wedding gift. His wife had been dead for 11 years. He had rotated it inward on the day of the amputation because the shortened stump meant it sat loose, and loose rings catch on equipment, and he was in a siege. He had never rotated it back. Some habits you keep past the reason for them, maybe especially then. He studied the stars and thought about what was coming. He had the files on every species that would be present in the Amber Vault's assembly. The Sorathi and their plate states. The Velzon, distributed energy beings in articulated exoframes who considered silence during conversation a form of aggression. The Thurvani, silicon lattice biology, who stored memory in the patterning of their crystalline skin. A Thurvani elder was literally a living archive, which meant that every elder in the room had personally witnessed centuries of history that Orek could only read about. The Kelhari, upright hexaptal neural growths along their spines that glowed when they were processing complex decisions. The Drathine. He spent the most time on the Drathine. Blobmorphic, no fixed form, communication through bioluminescent color pattern shifts across their surface. Oldest species in the convocation, their institutional memory predated the convocation itself, which meant they had been present for the founding, for every war since, for every enforcement action in 4 centuries. They could model the behavior of most known species with accuracy that other species called predictive and the Drathine called obvious. They had never encountered a species their models couldn't account for. He filed that away too. The young Kelhari aide who brought his food on the second day stood in the doorway longer than protocol required. Orek noticed he did not look up from his meal. The aide was young by Kelhari standards, its neural growths were thin, still developing the full crystalline structure of maturity, and they glowed steadily rather than pulsing, which meant it was processing at baseline rather than under load. It was looking at him the way the commander had not looked at him, not as a tactical problem, not as a category to be sorted, as something it was trying to understand. Most of the convocation species had looked at him as a curiosity. The Kelhari aide was the first to look at him as something that required effort. He ate his food, the aide left. He thought about that look for the rest of the transit. The Amber Vault announced itself before they arrived. Not visually, the approach through the ship's corridors gave no view of the exterior, but Orek felt the change in the Sorathi escort. The commander's plate lock, which had released during the transit, returned. The 3 warriors flanking him shifted their grip on their weapons. Not toward threat response, not the full combat posture, something between alert and ceremony, the body language of beings who were about to perform something they considered important. Then the doors opened, and the scale of the chamber erased everything else. The Amber Vault had been carved from the hollowed core of a slow-rotating moon. The interior curved in all directions, 400 meters of tiered galleries filled with beings from 31 species, and the walls, the bioluminescent walls, were running gold. A deep, satisfied gold that his files identified immediately. Drathine confidence color. The Drathine's emotional state set the baseline, and the baseline was certainty. He was brought to the central platform. He looked at the walls for a moment before he looked at the assembly. Gold, unbroken. Then he found the Drathine in the lower gallery. It was observing him. Its surface was amber, which was standard, but at the edges, where amber met the wall's gold, there was a flicker, barely visible. His files had no category for it. He filed it away. The convocation had not fought a contested war in 400 years. Their simulations were perfect, refined across millennia of enforcement action, tested against every known pattern of species resistance. Their simulations had never been wrong, not once, not in 11,000 years of recorded operation. Their simulations had never modeled an enemy that destroyed its own territory rather than surrender it. Primevorant Thesival emerged from the upper tier. 8 meters tall when fully extended, though it rarely extended fully in enclosed spaces, the Amber Vault was large enough that extension was possible, and Thesival chose it, which Orek read as deliberate. Exoskeletal plating in overlapping pale amber that yellowed toward black at the joints. 6 optical clusters arranged in a ring around a central vocal membrane. It moved by anchoring its rear limbs and pivoting its upper mass, the motion of a crane or a siege weapon, something built for leverage rather than speed. One anterior limb ended in a blade-fused growth rather than a manipulator, a wound taken 6,000 years ago, never corrected. Orek's files noted that Thesival's culture considered surgically removed scars a form of dishonesty. The growth was a choice, 6,000 years of deliberate choice carried in the body for anyone to read. He appreciated that actually, he understood it. The subsonic hum that accompanied Thesival reached Orek before the being's translated voice did. His teeth registered it as pressure, and his translator rendered it as faint static in the seconds before the harmonic conversion completed. Davin Orek, Thesival said, Fleet Elder of the Terran Consolidated Forces. It was not a question, it was a category being placed. Orek had been categorized. Yes, he said. The assembly stirred. 500 beings from 31 species had expected something more, a protest, a posture, a declaration of rights under whatever treaty humanity had not signed. He gave them one word and waited. What followed was a presentation. Orek had prepared for this. The Convocation's enforcement protocol was documented, which was itself a form of confidence. You only publish your process when you're certain the process cannot be countered. Species after species presented its military ledger. The Velzon, whose dreadnoughts could sustain orbital bombardment across a planetary surface for weeks. The Kelhari, whose tactical response times exceeded any known biological threshold. The Thurvani, who had personally witnessed wars that Orek could only access through records degraded by age and translation. Numbers, yields, historical victories. He listened the way he had learned to listen during the Karath corridor siege, attentive, noting what was useful, discarding what was performance. The walls pulsed orange-gold, amusement. The assembly found his stillness funny. In the lower gallery, the Drathine's amber had developed a second flicker, different from the first, broader, spreading toward its center. His translator offered nothing. He watched it between the speakers and said nothing. Thesival asked, eventually, the question they had all been building toward. Why would a species with 470 combat vessels refuse terms offered by a fleet of 50,000? Orek looked up at the Primevorant, the blade-fused limb, the 6,000 years. You have been telling me for 3 days why you will win, he said. I notice you have not told me what winning is for. The assembly erupted, not anger, laughter. The orange gold deepened and spread across the walls, and the sound that filled the vault was the combined expression of 30 species finding something genuinely, helplessly funny. The idea that a prisoner would question the point of their victory. The idea that winning required a point. In the lower gallery, the Drathine went still. Not the ambient stillness of an observer at rest, a different kind. The color pattern that had been flickering at its edges simply stopped moving. Orek's files noted that Drathine's stillness during high-stimulus events was rare. They were, by nature, reactive. Their surface responded to emotional input the way skin responded to temperature. He filed it away and waited for the laughter to end. It ended. Thesival raised a bladed limb and the chamber dropped to a murmur, then to silence. The walls bled back toward gold, slowly, the confidence color returning by degrees. The Primevorant studied Orek with 6 optical clusters that had been processing information since before humanity had writing. You may speak, it said, if you believe it relevant. Orek clasped his hands behind his back, the old military posture, left hand over right, the shortened finger tucked inward. He had stood this way in briefings and tribunals, and once in a courtroom where the question of whether he had exceeded his authority had been examined for 4 days and resolved in his favor on a technicality. He stood this way now because it was comfortable and because it was visible and because the shortened finger and the band were, for anyone who noticed, a piece of information. We've been fighting wars for at least 10,000 years, he said. His voice was quiet. In the amber vault's acoustics, quiet carried further than it should have. Probably longer, our records only go back with certainty that far. But there is no period in recorded human history where someone somewhere was not at war with someone else. Not one generation, not one century. A Velzon representative shifted in its exoframe, harmonic irritation. We know this, it said, primitive conflicts over resources and territory. The pattern is common among young species. Yes, Orek agreed. He said nothing else for a moment. Let me tell you about the scale, he said. He told them, not with drama. Drama was for audiences who needed to be convinced. This assembly did not need to be convinced of anything, which meant drama would have read as desperation. He used numbers, dates, the clinical specificity of a man reading from a ledger he had no emotional investment in, which was not accurate but was useful. 17 million dead in the First Global War, 4 years, chemical agents that poisoned soil for decades, the industrial mathematics of killing, not rage, not honor, logistics, how many casualties per unit of resource, how many deaths per tactical objective. The Second Global War, 70 to 85 million dead in 6 years. The atomic devices used against civilian population centers, not military installations, not strategic targets in the classical sense. Cities. The decision to use them made in rooms where the people making the decision understood what they were authorizing and authorized it anyway, because the alternative cost analysis produced a worse number. Mutually assured destruction. Thousands of devices pointed at each other for 50 years. Both sides prepared to use them, both sides knowing the other was prepared. The specific psychological condition of a civilization that has accepted as a daily operating premise that everything could end before dinner. You understand deterrence, he said. You described it as rational. It is rational, a Thurvani delegate said. Its crystalline skin caught the vault's light, prisming it. Mutually assured destruction prevents conflict by making conflict non-survivable for both parties. We called it a promise, Orek said, not a deterrent. There were 6 moments in those 50 years when the launch window opened and one person had to decide whether to believe it was a false alarm. 6 times. Each time one person chose not to report it as real. Each time that person was right. But the willingness was there, the weapons were armed, the decision had already been made institutionally. We were ready. The Thurvani said nothing. And those weapons, Orek continued, still exist, improved, more efficient. We haven't used them in 2 centuries, but the knowledge didn't go anywhere. That's not how knowledge works. He paused. The walls had gone from orange gold to something quieter, not gold, not quite amber. The Drathian's stillness had deepened. His translator had been attempting to categorize the color for 3 minutes and had produced only insufficient data. He was not surprised. Every weapon that has been described to me today, he said, we have used against ourselves. I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you so that when your commanders receive their reports, they have the correct reference material. The assembly did not laugh after that. They argued which was different. Species leaning toward each other, harmonics and color shifts in the grinding tones of Thurvani debate. The translation layer struggling to keep pace with 31 simultaneous conversations happening at the edges of what his device could process. Thesival let it run for a while, 40 seconds perhaps, which was itself information. In Orek's experience, a leader who lets argument run is either confident enough to allow it or uncertain enough to need it. The Prime Vorant's expression, to the extent that a being without a face could have one, gave him nothing. Then Thesival raised the bladed limb again. Silence. You have 1 rotation, Thesival said. Evacuate your colonies in human fringe space, return to your home system, and remain there pending convocation assessment of your species' readiness for civilized participation in galactic governance. Refuse, and we will remove the colonies ourselves. Orek nodded slowly. I understand, he said. He did not say anything else. They took him back to the holding cell. The Sarathi commander's plates locked again the moment Orek stopped responding to the escort's directional pressure, just stood in the corridor, not resisting, not moving, looking at nothing in particular. He was thinking about Vethai's reach, about the volunteers who had agreed to stay. He started walking again. The commander's plates didn't unlock until they were back at the cell door. By day 31, the convocation had committed 18% of its active fleet to human space. The war room's projections had predicted total pacification in 9 days. Orek had been moved to a larger holding area adjacent to the war room itself. Whether by oversight or intention, he wasn't sure, but the transparency of the partition meant he could see the holographic displays from his bench, which meant they wanted him to see the displays, which meant they wanted him to watch the numbers. He watched the numbers. He had watched Vethai's reach. They had moved him to an observation position for that. A courtesy, or what passed for one, the convocation wanted him present when the enforcement fleet arrived at the colony he had refused to evacuate. Wanted him to see the Colonial Defense Force, 97 ships of mixed designation and age, attempt to hold a system against Battle Group 7. 2,000 convocation vessels, the Sarathi enforcement arm, and a Velzon support complement. Enough firepower to reduce the colony's surface from orbit in under a day. He had sat on his bench and put his left hand flat on the containment field's rim. The repulsion pushed back against his palm, faint and constant. The band didn't catch, it faced inward. He had eaten the paste food first. Not because he was hungry, he wasn't particularly, but because he needed his strength and because there was nothing he could do in the next 4 hours that would change what was about to happen, and because sitting with untouched food in front of him would have been a performance he hadn't decided to give. The Colonial Defense Fleet lasted 22 minutes. Brave, absolutely genuinely brave, the commanders knew the math, the crews knew the math, and they fought anyway, pairing up to concentrate fire on single targets, covering each other's angles, attempting ramming maneuvers when weapons ran dry. He had served with people like that. He had buried people like that. Then the colony's entire power infrastructure detonated simultaneously. 300 Sarathi warships in low orbit had no time to jump. The shockwave took them before the nav systems could process the threat signature. Another 100 were caught in the plasma cascade. The remaining battle groups scattered, some making the jump to FTL, some simply moving away fast enough that the expanding debris field lost coherence before it reached them. The war room went silent. Orek stayed where he was, his hand on the containment field rim, band facing inward. Those had been volunteers. Every person who had stayed on Vethai's reach had known what staying meant. He had read the list, not all of them, but enough. A systems engineer who had grown up on the colony and refused to leave her parents' greenhouse. a retired orbital mechanic who had said in the recorded message that made it into the briefing that he had lived a full life and this seemed like a reasonable use of what was left of it. People with names, people with specific, irreplaceable reasons for being exactly where they were. He did not let himself look away from the display. The technicians began reporting the pattern repeating at other colonial systems. The bioluminescent walls of the adjacent chamber, visible through the war room's interior partition, had gone a color that his translator had been attempting to process for 6 minutes. It gave up, returned no translation available. He filed it away, he understood it more or less. Some things don't have words in any language, which doesn't mean they aren't real. The days that followed were an education, and the convocation was not the one receiving it. Auric watched from his containment field as engagement after engagement produced the same result. Tactical victory on paper, strategic erosion in practice. The Kalahari took colonies block by block, their neural growths burning bright with the processing load of counterinsurgency, work they had no doctrine for, against opponents who seemed to have no doctrine either except cost them something for every meter. A Kalahari commander's report on day 43 noted that his unit had taken 3 city blocks in 16 hours of fighting through structures that had been converted, every one of them, into defensive positions. The colony's civilian population had evacuated weeks earlier. What remained was people who had chosen to remain, which meant people who had done the math and decided this was where they would spend what they had. The report also noted 12 Kalahari casualties for 3 city blocks. The Velzon dreadnoughts, designed for engagement at range, found that human forces refused range. They fought in atmospheres, in debris fields, in the shadow of moons where dreadnought maneuvering was constrained and smaller ships were not. They struck and withdrew. They used sensor jamming clouds and false signatures, and in one documented case, a colony's entire civilian satellite network as a decoy array that occupied a Velzon targeting solution for 40 minutes while the actual human ships were somewhere else entirely. "We don't fight to hold ground," Auric said to no one in particular. He was not sure the technicians could hear him through the containment field. He said it anyway. "We fight to make the ground cost more than the ground is worth." Nobody responded, they were busy. In the lower gallery, the Drathine observer's color patterns had gone completely still. Not the stillness of observation, something else. His files noted that Drathine stillness during high-stimulus events was rare. His files had been compiled over 40 years and were, by his assessment, thorough. His files had never documented a Drathine going still and staying still for 11 consecutive days. He kept watching the displays. On day 60, the convocation's internal communications began appearing in the war room. Not intentionally, a technician had expanded the monitoring array to track human propaganda broadcasts, which were being transmitted across convocation space in formats calibrated for every known species' sensory range, and the expansion had pulled in convocation internal traffic as a secondary feed. Nobody moved to close it. Auric thought perhaps nobody had the authority to decide whether closing it was the right call, which was itself a kind of answer. 6 species arguments overlapped in the feed, the translation layer lagging by 2 to 4 seconds, producing a staggered effect where the same argument arrived in Thurvani grinding tones, then Velzon harmonic, then Kalahari clipped military register, each version slightly different because translation was interpretation and interpreters disagreed. The arguments were about strategy. That was new. For 60 days there had been no arguments about strategy because strategy had been assumed. 11,000 years of enforcement precedent was not a strategy you argued about, it was a strategy you executed. The fact that they were arguing meant the precedent was no longer self-evidently correct. Species blaming each other for specific engagement failures. Questions about resource allocation, whether the colonies being contested were worth the fleet elements being consumed contesting them. A Velzon senior member asking, in the harmonic register that the translator flagged as formal inquiry rather than rhetorical, what the convocation's definition of success in this campaign actually was. Auric had asked that question on day 1. He watched the Drathine observer's gallery position through the war room's interior partition. Still unchanged for 11 days, and then, at the edge of his vision, the color pattern moved. Not the flicker from day 1, not the insufficient data shift from the assembly. Something else, a pattern that spread from the Drathine's center outward, deliberate, held for several seconds, and then subsided. His translator offered nothing. But the Drathine was not looking at the war room displays. It was looking at him. Auric held its attention, or what passed for attention in a species that had no face, no eyes, no directional orientation that a human could read. But the pattern had been oriented toward his position, and it had held, and it had subsided only when he met it. The oldest species in the convocation had reached some kind of conclusion. He didn't know what the conclusion was. He sat with that uncertainty and did not let it show on his face, because his face was visible through the containment field, and he had been giving this assembly as little as possible to interpret for 60 days, and he was not going to stop now. Whatever the Drathine knew, it would keep until the Drathine chose to share it. He turned back to the displays and watched the numbers continue their slow, arithmetic reversal. The numbers on the war room displays kept changing and the arguments kept shifting, and Davin Orek kept watching both. Round 5 of what he had privately labeled the confrontation, though the convocation had no name for it because the convocation had never expected it to last this long, had settled into a pattern that he recognized from the Karath corridor siege. Not the specifics, the texture. The way a superior force that expects a short engagement starts to reorganize itself mentally for a longer one. The adjustments are small at first. A commander requests clarification on a tactic that should have been obvious. A supply requisition gets flagged for unusual quantities. Someone in a planning meeting asks a question that would have been pointless 3 weeks earlier. He had lived inside that texture for 8 months at Karath. He knew what it felt like from the outside too. The convocation's war room was living inside it now. Day 74, the holographic displays showed 11 active engagement theaters. In 9 of them, human forces were retreating, which was the accurate tactical description and also completely wrong as a strategic assessment because the retreats were costing more than the advances. So Rathi boarding units reported that every structure in the colonies they entered had been converted. Every tunnel had a prepared position. Every junction had been calibrated for defenders who knew the layout and attackers who didn't. The winning was getting done. It was just taking everything the winning was supposed to be worth. Across the partition, the Drathine's color pattern held. Still watching him, the rebellion dispatches started arriving on day 78. Not from human space, from convocation territory. 3 systems that had been under convocation governance for between 200 and 800 years had begun experiencing what the official reports called organized disruption of administrative infrastructure, which Orek translated as, "They watched us struggle and they drew conclusions." The reports were flagged priority secondary, which meant they were important but not as important as the active engagement theaters. A technician read them aloud at one point, summarizing for a senior Velzon coordinator who had asked. Orek listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill he had developed over 50 years of being in rooms where important things were said in front of him because no one expected him to understand. He understood. The convocation's authority was architectural. It held not because it was continuously enforced, but because enforcement was universally believed to be inevitable. Remove the belief and the architecture became load-bearing walls with no load to justify them. Human resistance had not weakened the convocation directly. It had done something more expensive. It had made the convocation's authority into a question. And questions once asked are difficult to unask. The Velzon coordinator requested military assets be redirected to address the rebellion dispatches. The prime warrant, visible at the far end of the war room, denied the request. All assets remained committed to human space. The coordinator's exoframe shifted, the harmonic equivalent of a frown. Orek filed it away. Human propaganda broadcasts had been running for 60 days by the time the weapons readiness signals appeared on the war room sensors. The broadcasts were not what the convocation had anticipated. They had expected desperation, appeals to mercy, documentation of suffering. The standard communication profile of a species that understood it was losing and was attempting to negotiate terms through public appeal. What they received instead were records. Every engagement, every human loss reframed not as defeat but as evidence of willingness to lose, which the broadcasts presented as the relevant data point. A single human ship ramming a convocation dreadnought before its drive failed became a 30-second sequence that had been transmitted to every species in the convocation's territory, formatted for 31 different sensory ranges. Colonists fighting through ruins while the structures collapsed around them. Not propaganda in the sense of manufactured emotion, documentation with no commentary, of people doing the thing they had said they would do. The message was not "we are winning." The message was "we are still here and we knew this was the cost and we paid it." Orek understood the distinction. He was not certain the convocation did. Then a technician called out in a tone that cut through the room's ambient noise. "The weapons readiness signals." He watched the displays update. Not in human space, from Earth's solar system. From stations around the colony planets that had not yet been directly engaged, from asteroid installations that had appeared on no prior convocation survey. Readiness signatures for weapons systems that the convocation sensors could categorize by type, but not by specific design. Nuclear arsenals in configurations that didn't match documented human military records. Biological containment facilities being brought online in orbital platforms. Chemical synthesis signatures from 3 separate locations. And then others, signatures that the sensors returned as unknown classification. He had been in the room when those systems were designed. Not all of them, some were developed after his active service, by people who had been told to plan for exactly this contingency and had done so with the thoroughness that characterized humans who believed their work would matter. He knew what the unknown classifications were. He did not say. The room processed the signals in the specific silence of experts encountering data they cannot explain quickly. The Drathine changed color for the second time. Not the flicker from day one, not the insufficient data shift from the assembly presentation. Something that spread across its entire surface, held for 11 seconds and subsided. His translator attempted the pattern for 4 minutes before returning a phrase he had not seen before in 6 weeks of monitoring. Conclusion reached. The Drathine still did not look at the displays. It was still looking at him. Auric met it, whatever attention meant for a species with no directional orientation. He offered it back, steadily, for the 11 seconds the pattern held. Then the Drathine's surface returned to its ambient amber and did not change again. He thought it knows how this ends. He thought it is known for a while. He thought that is either very good or very bad, and I will find out which when I find out which. He put his hand flat on the containment field's rim. The band, inward-facing, pressed gently against his shortened finger. The repulsion pushed back against his palm, faint and constant. He held the position until the feeling settled into background sensation, which took about 30 seconds, which was how long it had always taken. Some habits establish themselves before you notice you're forming them. On day 87, a Kalahari Fleet commander's transmission reached the war room direct. Protocol required such transmissions to be filtered through the communications processing unit before reaching the floor. This one wasn't. Whether that was an error or a decision, nobody in the room moved to address it, which Auric took as another answer to a question nobody was asking aloud. The commander's voice had the clipped cadence of Kalahari military register, but underneath it, in the pauses between phrases, something had changed. Auric had listened to enough humans under sustained pressure to recognize what sustained pressure did to a cadence. The Kalahari register was different from human military speech. The tells were different, but the underneath was the same. The commander was exhausted. Not from fighting, from winning and finding that the winning didn't produce what winning was supposed to produce. His unit had cleared 17 city blocks over 42 days. Every block had been defended by people who knew they would not hold it and held it anyway, extracting cost, and then moved to the next position and held that until they couldn't, and so on down the street. The Kalahari had taken the blocks. They now governed rubble. They were securing ruins that had no economic value, no strategic utility, no function except as evidence that they had been there. The commander asked directly and formally and with no apparent expectation that the question was inappropriate, what the strategic purpose of continuing was. The Primevorant did not answer immediately. In the 6 seconds before the response came, Auric heard the war room's ambient sound in a way he hadn't since the first day. Displays cycling, life support, the faint static of Thesival's subsonic presence which he had stopped consciously registering weeks ago. The Primevorant told the commander to continue the operation. The commander acknowledged and the channel closed. Nobody in the room said anything. Auric watched Thesival's optical clusters move across the displays, not focusing on any single theater, just moving, the way a person moves their eyes when they are not looking for information but thinking through something that requires the appearance of looking. He had done it himself, in the Karath corridor, in the 4 months before he understood that the siege was not going to break the way sieges were supposed to break, and he had to revise every assumption he'd started with. He recognized the look. He said nothing. Day 91 arrived the way the previous 30 had arrived, with the war room's displays showing numbers that had stopped trending in any direction the convocation's projections had anticipated. The room was quieter than it had been at any point since the engagement began. Not because the war was going well, because the arguments had stopped. And arguments stop either when a question is resolved or when the people arguing have run out of ways to frame it. The convocation's coordinators had run out of frames. They were doing their work in the silence of people who have kept working past the point where the work feels like it's connected to an outcome. Auric had not slept much. He hadn't slept much at Karath either. Old soldiers and sleeplessness, the relationship was so standard that he had stopped thinking of it as a problem sometime in his 50s and had reclassified it as information. If he wasn't sleeping, something was due. Something was due. He was sitting on his bench, doing nothing, not studying the displays, not reviewing his files, not running the numbers he had been running for 3 months. Just sitting, looking at the viewport, the stars and the positions he knew by designation. The door opened. No hum. Primevorant Thesival entered the cell, and the first thing Auric noticed was the size of it in 6 meters of enclosed space. Outside in the amber vault or the war room, the 8-meter scale was context, large within large. Here it was different. The ceiling accommodated the height, but barely. The blade-fused interior limb, folded against the thorax, came within arm's reach of the opposite wall. No guards, no recording device that Orek could identify. No log entry. He knew this because the door had opened without the access chime that accompanied every logged entry, and he had been listening for that chime for 91 days because that was the kind of thing you listened for when you were in a holding cell and information was scarce. Thesival settled itself into the space across from the bench. 6 optical clusters, 6,000 years of deliberate scar, the blade growth tucked in, the wound that had never been corrected, the body made into a record that no one could edit. Why? One word, no harmonics, requiring translation. Orek had been waiting for this question, not because he had known Thesival would come. He had given it 30% odds, which were not bad odds but were not certainty. He had been waiting for it because it was the correct question, and if Thesival was capable of asking the correct question privately, in a room with no witnesses, then the conversation he had been trying to have for 91 days was finally happening. He set his left hand flat on the bench beside him, the band inward. The light in the cell caught the metal and produced nothing, no glint, no reflection. It faced the wrong direction for that. Because you gave us a choice between existing on your terms and not existing at all, he said, and we have a very old answer for that question. Through the cell's viewport, the amber vault's bioluminescent walls were visible as a curved section of the moon's interior surface. While he had been watching the viewport over the past 91 days, the walls had never gone dark, not once. Even during the Vethai's Reach engagement, even during the weapons readiness signal discovery, the organisms had kept cycling, reduced in intensity, shifted in color, but present. They were dark now. All of them, every colony of bioluminescent organisms across 400 meters of surface, simultaneously without light. The Convocation's technicians, visible through the war room partition, had noticed. He could see them checking instruments, cross-referencing readings, doing the things technicians do when instruments report something that instruments are not supposed to report. Your species will take casualties it cannot recover from, Thesival said. Yes, and you accept this. We accepted it before I boarded that ship. He kept his voice level, not flat level, which was different. Flat was the absence of feeling. Level was feeling held at operating temperature. The people who stayed on Vethai's Reach accepted it. That's not a threat, Prime Vorant. That's just what we are when you back us into the last room. Thesival's blade-fused limb shifted slightly against its thorax. A small motion, he watched it. You volunteered for this, Thesival said. Yes, knowing the probability. 73% chance of dying before a conversation could occur. He said it the way he had filed it away months ago as information. I calculated that was better odds than anything else we had. The walls stayed dark. Orek was very tired. Not the tiredness of sleeplessness. He had 91 days of that behind him, and it had settled into background sensation, classified alongside the repulsion field and the paste food and the hum of the vault's power conduits. This was the tiredness that came after. The weight that arrived when the thing you had been holding yourself for had arrived, and you could, carefully, set some of it down. He looked at Thesival. You asked me 91 days ago why my government sent an old man, he said. Young soldiers still calculate. They calculate whether they might survive, whether a better outcome is achievable, whether the odds are worth the cost. I stopped calculating a long time ago. When you stop, you get very clear about what you're protecting. He paused. And very clear about what you're willing to pay for it. Thesival was silent for a long time. Outside the viewport, the walls remained dark. The Convocation, Thesival said, is prepared to negotiate. 8 words, no harmonics, no institutional register. Just the words in the translated flat affect of a being that had set down its own version of what it had been holding. Orek nodded once. The Drathine's gallery position, visible through the war room partition, was empty. It had not been there since the walls went dark. He didn't know when it had left. He filed it away and sat with it and said nothing. The withdrawal terms took 6 days to formalize. Full convocation withdrawal from all contested human space. Reparations for the destroyed colonies. Paid in construction materials and terraforming assistance rather than acknowledged as moral debt. Orek had pushed for the latter and accepted the former, because what you called a thing mattered less than what the thing was, and what it was the Convocation paying for what it had done. A non-aggression framework. Humanity agreed not to deploy the species-targeted weapons systems. The Convocation agreed not to re-enter human space without negotiated consent. Both parties understood without saying it that the galaxy's political architecture had just changed permanently. Neither party said it because saying it would require acknowledging what the change meant for the institutions that had to live inside the new architecture. Thesival announced the withdrawal to the full Convocation Assembly in language that allowed every member species to interpret the decision as their own. Auric watched from his position near the war room entrance, no longer in the containment field, which had been deactivated on day 92 without ceremony or explanation. The Primevorant's harmonics were precise. The institutional dignity was intact. The Convocation would survive this. That had always been Thesival's primary obligation, above victory, above enforcement, above the 11,000-year precedent. The institution must persist. The ancient being understood that. He had understood it since he read the files. He watched the assembly receive the announcement and felt the room reorganize itself around the new information. Species that had been arguing for different tactical approaches shifted into the posture of species calculating how this outcome would read in their own political histories. It was not cynical. It was governance. He had spent 50 years inside governance, and he had made his peace with the gap between what governance was and what it said it was. The Drathian gallery position remained empty through the announcement. On the morning of the 94th day, Auric was standing in the middle of holding Bay 9's sable when the Drathian arrived. He had nothing to pack. He had arrived with nothing, and he was leaving with nothing, which was appropriate and also slightly funny in a way he didn't explain to anyone. He was simply standing, looking at the viewport, the stars in their designations, when the door opened. The Drathian occupied the doorway, no translation, no words. Its surface shifted, a pattern spreading from center outward, deliberate, specific, held for 11 seconds. His translator offered the phrase it had returned before, acknowledging the limits of the model. He looked at it for the 11 seconds it held the pattern. Then it withdrew and the door closed, and he was alone again for the last time in the amber vault. He took it as a goodbye. It seemed like the right interpretation, or at least the one he would carry. The Convocation shuttle that returned him to human space carried no escort. He sat alone in the passenger compartment for 16 hours. The shuttle's viewport showed the transit corridor, FTL travel rendered as a particular quality of nothing, not dark, not light, the visual equivalent of a held breath. He had made this trip in reverse 94 days ago, bound and uncertain, and he made it now in silence, unbound, equally uncertain, which told him something about uncertainty that he had probably always known. He ate the food the shuttle's dispenser produced, which was marginally better than the paste food from the holding cell and marginally worse than anything he would have chosen. He slept for 3 hours, which was good for him. When the shuttle broke FTL and the stars returned to their proper positions, he looked at the designations and found the ones he knew. The reconstruction site at Greyline Anchor Station was quieter than stations were supposed to be. Not silent, construction was loud, and the people doing the work were people who talked during work, which he found reassuring. But the underlying tone of a place that had been louder was present in the specific way that he had learned to hear during 50 years of visiting sites after events. New structures stood next to outlines in the ground where other structures had been. The outlines would take time to go away. Some of them wouldn't. He walked the perimeter. No one accompanied him. He had requested the space, and the station's acting commander had given it without asking why, which was its own kind of courtesy. He stopped at the edge of what had been a residential quarter. The outlines there were smaller, family scale. He stood for a while. Coming back was not the same as returning. He had known this before he left, and he knew it now with the specific completeness of knowing something in your body rather than your head. The colonies that had survived were quieter than they had been. The people who remained were the ones who had stayed or come back, which were different categories with different weights. Some things did not come back the same way they left. He had learned that at Karath too, and had kept learning it, because it was the kind of lesson that required repetition before it settled. A Convocation shuttle had brought him home alone. No escort, no record of the visit in the official communication logs. The Convocation's diplomats would spend years explaining that. He thought about what the explanation would look like from the inside of the institution, the linguistic work required to make "we returned him without ceremony" read as a dignified choice rather than an acknowledgement of what the choice cost. He thought about Thesival's 8 words, delivered without harmonics. He thought about a gallery seat, empty, and 11 seconds of untranslatable color held in a doorway on the last morning. He rotated the band inward, old habit. The kind you keep past the reason for it, past the siege that made it necessary, past the years that turned it from caution into reflex. The kind that means something different at 94 days than it meant at the start of them, though what it means has not changed, only your understanding of what it was always meaning. He stood in the outline of what had been a residential quarter, on a reconstruction site that was quieter than stations were supposed to be, in the early light of a star he knew by designation, and held the position until his hand remembered itself. The amber vault's walls, they told him later, stayed dark for 9 days after the withdrawal. No one could account for it. The Drathian wouldn't comment. Auric thought he understood, but he kept that to himself. Some things you let the other side figure out on their own.